high with, Mika or Joe?
Oh, I love how you said, let's get serious for a second here. And I was anticipating something different, but I'm going to go Joe on this one, and here's why. Joe can do deep dives on all the things you talk about when you're high, I'm told, which is music.
You went
sports.
to Vanderbilt, buddy. Nice try. Well, any response?
He picked Joe?
Yes. Yeah. I'm surprised, too. That glass of red wine tells me you're ready to relax at all times here. Joe, how do you take that description of you as the guy who can get deep on the doob?
Yeah, you know what?
I've never seen that.
I'd love if I were going to do that. Willie would be the guy I would choose.
Really?
It'd be a lot of fun.
Okay.
Yeah. Why?
Yeah.
Gail Kate?
Yep.
Well, she says.
That's what I was going to ask. What broadcaster would you want to get high with? And you say Gail?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you have no idea what she's going to say when she's not high. So.
Well,
Mika, I have a
welcome
solution.
back to Morning Joe.
All of us together.
No, I don't.
You, me,
no,
Joe, and Gail.
Yeah.
No? And Donnie.
How
Let's
about
get Donnie,
not?
too.
Oh, my God. No, that would be awful.
Theoretically.
That would be just, you know what? I think the best idea is to just not. Welcome back to Morning Joe. It is Friday, April 23rd. That was fun last night on Colbert. And thanks, Willie, for picking Joe. We'll talk.
It wasn't it was a binary choice. Not to say I wouldn't want to enjoy those pleasures with you as well.
Yeah? Okay. All right.
I would pick Steve Ratner. I would pick Steve Ratner. Steve Ratner would be the guy I would pick.
Okay.
You know, you think about Steve Ratner, how crazy things would get. That's the guy I would go with.
Think of those charts. Okay. The AP's Jonathan Lemire is still with us. And joining the conversation, we have NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent and host of Way Too Early, Casey Hunt. Donnie Deutsch is here, and Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University, Christina Greer. And we apologize for this conversation,
Sorry,
Christina.
Professor.
Joe will be back on Monday. We're going to get to the news now. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill take a key step forward toward police reform. We have new reporting on that in just a moment. But first, we want to look at this week's verdict in Derek Chauvin trial. One of the alternate jurors is recounting the testimony she heard and is weighing in on why she feels she would have voted guilty. She spoke with NBC News correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, who filed this report.
It's really sad. How did a $20 bill in question end up in somebody's death? It boggles my mind.
Lisa Christensen was one of the alternate jurors who did not get to deliberate over Derek Chauvin's fate.
Were you disappointed when you were dismissed from the jury?
Absolutely, I was.
You wanted to vote. You would have voted guilty.
I would have.
She listened to the 14 days of testimony and took extensive notes.
What stood out for me is that video. They took a still photo of it, of him so real and so genuine. I mean, I felt their feelings, I felt their pain, I felt their guilt.
It's one of the alternate jurors there, Gabe Gutierrez, reporting for us. Let's turn to police reform. Democratic Congresswoman Karen Bass says she's waiting for the blessing of House leadership to enter into formal negotiations with Republican Senator Tim Scott. And yesterday, Congresswoman Bass received word that she could go forward.
She has our full support. She is fair. She wants to get it done. I trust Karen Bass's knowledge of the subject, but also her knowledge of the ramifications it would have on the people that we're trying to protect, which is everybody in our country, including our law enforcement officers. So I trust her to keep on the table what can be accomplished.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who already has praised Senator Scott's efforts, is next to sign off on formal negotiations. Congresswoman Bass says she and the South Carolina Republican already have been trading documents and exploring areas of compromise. Senator Scott said earlier this week a deal may be reached within the next 2 weeks. So, Casey, we're talking about the sort of back and forth negotiations on this, but let's get into the policy of it. Where are the areas where they might agree and where are the sticking points?
So, Willie, the top sticking point here is what to do about something that's called qualified immunity. And that's a way of describing whether police officers are liable themselves for their conduct when something bad happens, or whether it is simply the police department or some other entity that a family would have to sue. So Republicans are concerned about eliminating qualified immunity, whereas Democrats say that's what we absolutely need to do in order to have any meaningful change here. There are also conversations around other things like no-knock warrants, like chokeholds. Those are issues that came up in the cases of Breonna Taylor and Eric Garner in New York. So those are some of the other things here. But broadly, I think they are prepared to make some changes. There's some discussions about whether they may be able to come to a compromise, for example, on the qualified immunity question, by making police departments more liable in those particular cases. So I do think, though, that from a big picture perspective, it's really remarkable that we are at this point where there seems to be a willingness for both sides to talk to each other on this, a push to actually do something that Republicans may go along with. I think that underscores the impact that what happened to George Floyd, the protests that swept the country in the wake of that, has had on our politics.
Professor Greer, I'm just curious, in studying the events that led up to the death of George Floyd, and also the events that led up to the death, everything that happened before the shot was fired into Daunte Wright, leading to his death. What does police reform really look like? And is it all about the cops? Is it only about the cops?
Mika, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm still jarred every time I see the video of Derek Chauvin leaning on George Floyd. We can't get immune to that. That's one. I think we have a real conversation about institutional change. You know, many of the police officers in the Minnesota Police Department have gone through extra training, and clearly it didn't work. We'll see that when the other remaining officers go on trial in August. I think a great start is that we have Merrick Garland at the head of the DOJ. Hopefully some real substantive change will, you know, if we confirm Kristen Clark, the work of Vanita Gupta and the Civil Rights Division will really set some precedent, not just in the DOJ, that will hopefully trickle down to police departments across the country, large and small. It's beyond just a few bad apples. It's beyond just a few incidents. We have to have a real systematic, widespread clearing out of officers and officers who aid and abet this type of behavior. There are far too many communities and families who have gone through this very same thing that the Floyd family has gone through, and we don't even know about it. And so you think about what that does to a community. It has to be a systemic change from Washington, D.C. to police departments across the country.
Absolutely. Republicans have a $568 billion counter-proposal for an infrastructure package, one that Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia calls, quote, the most robust plan we've ever put forward as Republicans. NBC News reports it calls for $299 billion for roads and bridges, more than $60 billion for both broadband and infrastructure and public transit systems, $35 billion for drinking water and wastewater, $44 billion for airports, and $20 billion for rail systems. It also sets aside a collective $45 billion for ports, water storage, and safety items. The plan calls for the tax cuts passed under former President Donald Trump to be kept intact, and to repurpose unspent federal funding passed as part of COVID-19 relief packages for infrastructure spending. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said aides plan to look into the details of the proposal and discuss it with congressional staff in the coming days. Donnie Deutsch, I mean, just hearing the framework of what the Republicans are putting forward, just the hope for bipartisanship, I don't know, is it dimming a bit?
Yeah, I think it's dimming. I got to also tell you, I'm a little more on the side of the Republicans at this point. I'm a deficit hawk, and I ran a business, and at some point you just can't keep spending. And I know we're giving Biden a lot of kudos for making a lot of big moves. But I think that the coronavirus package could have done the job with half as much money. And I don't know if we need the total amount of the infrastructure bill. It's just you start to get to a point where your just gut tells you we just can't keep spending and just basically bottomless pit. I mean, at some point, the music's going to stop, and there are going to be people without chairs. So it's very easy. It's very easy to get caught up in the public. The public is behind it. But of course, the public's behind it. We're going to do this. If you said to the public, let's send $5,000 to everybody and bankrupt the government, they'll go fine. So we at some point, and also at some point, I know I'm going to get lambasted from this as the guy who's at some point taxes get to a point where it's just you can't raise taxes to a certain point where you start to not de-incentivize capitalism. I'm going to get thrown off the air for all this stuff. They're going to move me over to Fox, and I'm not. Everybody knows where my heart is, but there's something as a business guy that just tells me we're running a little amok here.
Yeah, there's a lot of other reasons we would throw you off right now, actually. No, just kidding. So, Casey, in the list that I read, and I know that they're going through this with far more detail, but was there any room for bipartisanship, for some sort of agreement in this Republican proposal?
Well, Mika, I don't think that anything that's laid out in the Republican proposal in terms of spending is necessarily going to be disagreements. I think that the difference is simply how much and what kinds of projects are you willing to pay for. And, just to push back slightly on what Donnie had to say, I mean, the idea that the Biden administration has put forward is to pay for a lot of this with an increase on corporate rates that would not take those corporate rates up as high as where they were before. I mean, they were over 30% under the Trump administration. They've been there for a long time. We have rates that are competitive compared to other Western countries. The Trump administration lowered them all the way down now to 21. Now they're saying, OK, how about they said 28. Joe Manchin says 25. I mean, we're not talking about some sort of business tax increase that would be, out of this world or a huge change away from the capitalist society that we have been living in this entire time. And it's actually popular with voters when you say, OK, we're going to rebuild bridges in your town. We're going to help make it easier for you to take care of your elderly or aging parents. We're going to offer additional family leave, and we're going to do it by taxing corporations. I mean, that plays well, and it also doesn't necessarily represent the kind of deficit spending that might get us into trouble. Now, the reality is we may see a bill where that doesn't happen because it is hard politically to raise taxes, and Democrats are still likely to go it alone, and they may do it that way. They may use more deficit spending than what was laid out initially in the Biden administration plan. So it's complicated, but I think that the top line here, Mika, I would say, is that people are actually talking to each other. There are efforts underway. Some of them are bearing fruit, not necessarily here, but in other areas. That bodes well across the board.
Jonathan Lemire, we're talking big numbers when $568 billion is a lowball offer from Republicans. So what does the White House do with this counter proposal? We've heard actually in the last couple of days from Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat from Delaware, talking about maybe breaking this up and doing the infrastructure, the roads and bridges that the parties agree on as one bill where you could get 60 votes and maybe doing the rest on reconciliation. How's the White House taking this counteroffer from Republicans?
Yeah, Willie, we haven't seen dollar signs this big since we totaled up the money the Yankees have spent since their last World Series title in 2009.
Went a long way for that insult.
What we are seeing here, what we were saying here for what the White House has looking at this is that, yes, they are hoping to do this in a bipartisan fashion. But first, to a point that Casey just made, one of their arguments here is that to business leaders about the corporate tax rate going up is that they're saying, you guys didn't even ask for 21%. President Trump and the Republicans cut your taxes more than you requested. All we're trying to do now is bring it back up a little bit, nowhere near where it was before, a politically popular measure. So that's part of this. They've also suggested perhaps some openness to paying for some of it via user fees, like tolls and so on. That's something that's also being negotiated, perhaps, to be able to lower the tax rate slightly. We're also seeing, though, to disappoint Donnie, there's going to be more. The president's speech next week on Wednesday, when he hits the 100-day mark, and that's going to be when he unveils part 2 of this program, which could be another $1 trillion. This one more focused on healthcare and childcare and sort of reshaping the American economy, more of the sort of the more personal rather than bricks and mortar. And yes, this is all up for negotiation. The White House has taken a very different tact here than they did with the COVID relief bill, which they said, look, this is what we're doing. We want to do this as quickly as possible. We're not going to negotiate much around the margins. They got that done in under 2 months, signed into law. This one, they're giving themselves a lot more time. They were willing to perhaps, right now they want to do it one big piece. They're not ruling out splitting it up. They're not ruling out anything. They're going to give this time. Initial proposals around Memorial Day, hash it out over the summer, have it done by September. That seems to be the rough timeline. They believe that gives them the freedom and flexibility to come forth with some sort of deal that perhaps could get Republican support. But again, they have the reconciliation card in their back pocket. They can do it on party lines if they have to.
All right, Christina Greer, I'm just curious, and what do you think bipartisanship means? When the Biden administration touts it, is it because a certain measure or proposal is popular in the country in a bipartisan way among Democrats and Republicans, or actually getting votes from Republicans, which could be hard to come by on some levels?
Yeah, I think it will be difficult to come by for sure, because Republicans have shown that they're just not interested in working with Democrats in many ways, and they want to be obstinate still post-Trump days. I mean, but the good thing is this. We have a few areas of optimism. One, Joe Biden was a public servant for, several decades, and he can have some hard conversations with some of his colleagues, hoping to pull them out of the haze that they were under Donald Trump, and convince them that this is what's best for the American people. And hopefully, one, maybe two, will break away from their party and be brave and do what's best. I mean, unlike Casey, I am going to push back on Donnie because, part of the social safety net is what Democrats constantly try to build and try and explain to their Republican colleagues. This is what needs to happen, because we see this pendulum constantly swing. Republicans give tax breaks to the wealthy on some, antiquated Reaganomics trickle-down nonsense that never happens. Rich people just don't put the money back into the economy, and they're not paying their fair share of taxes. Democrats come in and they have to build the social safety net and try and help families and schools and bridges and roads and all the things that we need to make a society function. Republicans come back into power and they give tax breaks again to the wealthy. So this is a cycle that has to end, and hopefully Joe Biden can articulate to certain senators especially that it is in the best interest for them and their state to actually help pass this bill for the good of the American people.
Okay, Donnie, you have been voted off the island. Wow. So
yes, I'm. Can I read?
Okay.
Can I do a little rebuttal? Because I'm saying things that I think a lot of people believe. We just can't keep spending, guys. It's just common sense. You just just we can't keep throwing. What do you mean? I'm just saying it's just. I ran a business. I'm just speaking frankly. I know I want puppy dogs and ice cream and fairy tales and all these things. You just can't keep spending. It's that simple. You got to look at a ledger sheet, and it doesn't. It's just basic economics. And if you got a lot of economists on, they're going to agree with you. I know I'm the bad guy, and I'm Grinch, and I'm Scrooge, and all of it. And I'm a progressive guy. I just know at some point I look at a ledger sheet. And you just can't keep bringing up things, and the deficit goes and goes and goes and goes and goes and goes, and at some point it blows. Okay, that's it. I'm the bad guy. I'll go to Fox. I'll see everybody later. I love you.
And there's nothing wrong with spending as long as people pay their fair share of taxes, and that's where the rubber hits the road.
I'm a guy that if you add up what I'm paying, I'm in trouble. I'm going to get killed on this one. I mean, I'm paying over 70 cents on the dollar. No, but I just guys, they're just if you look at historically, okay, I'm gonna stop.
But Donnie, go to the corporate tax. Forget about you and your furniture budget. We can see that behind you. But go to the corporate tax rate, going up to 28%. What does that do to your company?
Does it do it? By the way, I'm okay with that. Okay, I'm just let's focus on the spending. You just can't keep spending, guys. Okay, I know no matter how I slice it here, I'm coming from a place where I'm an easy target. You just can't keep spending. That's all I'm saying. Let's leave it at that.
So to validate, I actually do understand what you were saying, and it is a valid point, Donnie. But we are kidding about voting him off the island. We'll revisit this. It's a really, really good conversation and debate. We're going to move now to Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny addressing his supporters in an emotional Instagram post yesterday. The imprisoned Putin critic wrote in part that he's proud to be a part of people who are not afraid despite all the anger and hatred that is now flowing from the Kremlin. Because Vladimir Putin understands to be afraid now is to lose, sell, and waste your own future. You walked with me yesterday, but today I will lie on the bunk and imagine how I am walking with you and for you. Joining us now, correspondent for GQ magazine, Julia Yaffe. Julia, if you could tell us everything you know about exactly what's happening with Alexei Navalny and why his life sort of hangs in the balance in this U.S.-Russia relationship, because, in some ways, some might say that Putin would want to get rid of him. At the same time, it seems like that would be the last thing they would want to happen now. Can you explain that?
Well, Putin did try to get rid of him. In August of last year, the FSB, as we now know, poisoned Alexei Navalny with Novichok, a military-grade nerve agent. And he barely survived, made it out of there, and returned to Russia knowing that he would be arrested. The authorities said as much. And he was arrested right at passport control, was separated from his wife, taken into custody, and eventually given a 2.5-year sentence. He's been experiencing numbness in his extremities, in his hands and feet, and it's not clear if this is something new, if this is the after effects of the nerve agent, because so few people have survived poisoning with Novichok. And he has been on hunger strike for over 3 weeks now, consuming only water, and people who have seen him, including his lawyers, say this past weekend they said he could die at any moment, and that it was just a matter of days. Yesterday, we saw an open letter from his doctors saying, please stop the hunger strike. We got some results. We got some movement from the authorities. There was a release of his test results. He got some vitamin treatment, and they are begging him to stop the hunger strike because it has become so dangerous. I do think, though, that, if the Kremlin did manage to off Alexei Navalny while in prison, I think this has been a bone of contention a little bit, that if he starves himself to death in prison, he's kind of doing the Kremlin's work for them. So it was kind of a fine balancing act. But, the Kremlin killed Boris Nemtsov in 2015 and suffered no repercussions. We know that there's very little that the U.S. can do to Russia. The sanctions, the Russians just, take it in stride and decide that it's worth the pain to achieve their geopolitical and domestic political objectives. I think that if Alexei Navalny, God forbid, were to die in prison, there's not that much that the U.S. could do to punish Russia. And Russia knows that.
And so the very Russian government that tried to kill him, as you described, what is there an effort to try and force feed him, keep him alive because of the stakes? Or you think the stakes not that high? And how does he fare? What is Alexei Navalny the symbol of right now in Russia for Russians?
So this week he was transferred to the hospital of a nearby penal colony, which is even worse and more notorious than the one he was in before. Former inmates have spoken about being tortured in this hospital. An orderly in this hospital was investigating for torturing a prisoner to death. So it's not much of an improvement, but he's apparently getting some kind of vitamin drip and a glucose IV. So hopefully getting pulled back from the jaws of death a little bit. I think the reason you saw so many people come out to protest in Moscow and St. Petersburg and across all of Russia's 11 time zones, including in fairly provincial towns and cities, is that despite all the threats coming from the Kremlin, despite all the promises of punishment for protesting, Navalny remains the only voice, credible voice, an organized voice of opposition to Vladimir Putin and the regime he has created, which has kind of sunk into corruption. And, you saw this crazy Russian troop buildup on the border of Ukraine. At the same time, the Russian government had to stop exporting grain because it's trying to control prices internally. It's trying to control prices for basic foodstuffs like eggs and sugar. There's talk of a sugar deficit this year in Russia. A poll came out today saying that over half of Russians are in favor of food stamps because things are just not going well internally. Meanwhile, the elite is buying, using taxpayer rubles, as it were, ever more lavish palaces, which Navalny and his team keep highlighting. And I think people are sick of it. This is the only kind of feasible, barely alternative to Vladimir Putin.
All right, Julia Yaffe, thank you very much for being on. And still ahead on Morning Joe, the pause in the use of Johnson & Johnson's coronavirus vaccine could soon be lifted. But has the White House already written off the shot? Plus, we continue our conversation about whether wearing a mask is necessary if you're outside. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
To people, you still need to wear a mask.
This is a question that we're looking at. One of the things I think that's really important to understand is while there's wonderful news and we're getting more and more people vaccinated every single day, we still had 57,000 cases of COVID yesterday. We still had 733 deaths. And so while we are really trying to scale up vaccination, we have this complex message that we still have hotspots in this country. And we will be looking at the outdoor masking question, but it's also in the context of the fact that we still have people who are dying of COVID.
That's CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky yesterday on the Today Show, talking about the debate over whether people should still be mandated to wear a mask outside. Joining us now, physician and fellow at the Brookings Institution, Dr. Kavita Patel. She's a former Obama White House Health Policy Director and an MSNBC medical contributor, and writer and reporter for the New York Times, David Leonhardt. Good morning to you both. Dr. Patel, let me start with you. It was something to watch Dr. Walensky kind of hem and haw over that question. Is there any scientific evidence that shows not wearing a mask far from other people outdoors is a risk of COVID-19?
Yeah. Hi, Willie. Good morning. I've rarely seen an issue that divides the public health community so fervently as this one. But there is, to your question, there is very little scientific proof that if you're outdoors and you're not symptomatic and you're distanced and you do not need to wear a mask, that the risk is very low. Infection transmission has not been recorded. So I have not seen any evidence of it. And it's why I've been telling people pre-vaccination, post-vaccination, if you're away from others, you do not need to wear a mask. However, we still have a lot of factors going on, such as community transmission. We've got places where cases still are rising, and we have the threat of variants, as well as the fact that we still only have about half the population vaccinated. So today, I think it's very reasonable, and I wear a mask if I'm in an outdoor space, but with kind of crowded people, kind of a rally or an outdoor concert of some kind, and I know that I'm not going to be able to reliably keep distance from people.
So is the CDC not saying that clearly because there's a messaging problem, that they worry that if they say, you know what, you don't need to wear a mask outside as long as you're distanced, that the American people will hear you don't need to wear a mask at all, outside, indoors, anywhere? Or in other words, why won't they just come out and say, look, if you're out for a run, there's nobody around, you don't have to have your mask on?
Yeah, I think, Willie, honestly, I think it's part the messaging. A lot of it is the science, because I think we're looking at cases. If you look at Israel, they dropped the outdoor mask mandate, Willie, only when they went to barely any cases and about 85% of their country being vaccinated. So I'm just using that as a milestone. The CDC is also looking at data of kind of daily for 100,000 case rate. And I think the effect that you mentioned is really a critical one. If they send a signal that, quote, outdoor masks are not necessary, I've had the very conversations with mayors and governors who have said, well, what constitutes outdoors? And then there becomes kind of this issue of scope creep. What I'm worried about more, I'll be honest, the outdoor mask debate, I'd much rather replace that with the indoor mask debate, which is still being debated, by the way, in some states where they do not have indoor mask requirements. And I would plea and beg to say, at a minimum, make sure that we have indoor masking until we get to a certain level of vaccination. And I'll just add that I'm watching what's happening in India and other countries. The threat of kind of concerning variants does not escape any of us who study public health. And as policymakers, which is what the CDC has to think of, their job is ultimately to protect and mitigate risk. And to be honest with you, Willie, I don't know how wearing a mask puts you at that much risk or is that much of an imposition. I understand it's not convenient. but it's certainly not a big intervention in the big picture.
I want to get to David in just a second, but since you mentioned India, my goodness, the scenes we're seeing out of that country are just breathtaking. The numbers we're seeing are breathtaking. What is going on there, and is there any lesson to be learned for us here?
Yeah, I've actually had family almost on a daily basis. We have large families still in India. I'm a Patel, and almost every day I'm getting a call that someone's died or asking if I have a connection that I can send remdesivir or steroids. And so it kind of breaks my heart to think about, how much we have and what they don't have. But for lessons learned, a couple of things, Willie. We thought India would escape the worst of it just because we hadn't seen the numbers. And it just reminds us that even though we don't see some of those numbers in places like Texas and other parts of the country right now, it's entirely possible we could get.
So, David, you're writing about all this irrational fears in America around COVID, outdoor masking as well. There is a sense that people are afraid to step back into normal life as much as we all say we want to, and we do want to. That taking off the mask, even if you're out for a run, or maybe taking it off while you eat dinner inside, is a violation of these things that we've come to accept as necessary to get us through this.
Yeah, I think there are a few things going on here. I mean, one, I do think the public health messaging has been off. Look, there isn't a single documented case that I'm aware of anywhere in the world of brief, casual outdoor contact, like passing someone on a sidewalk, leading to transmission. None. Right. And so this is a tiny risk. And I understand why the CDC often wants to be extremely cautious and they want to do studies first. And they never want to say anything that might lead people to take more risks. But I think public health messaging should trust people a little bit more and should basically say, look, you do not need a mask outdoors. If you want to wear one outdoors, that's fine. If you're in close conversation with someone outdoors, you should wear one. And you really, really should wear one indoors, because I think people will be more likely to listen if we're honest with them rather than always kind of dialing it up. And part of what's going on here is people are very afraid to take any risk, but we take risk every day in our lives. I mean, we get in cars and we eat food, which we could choke on, and we go swimming. And so I think it would be really helpful if we started treating people a little bit more like adults than the CDC has been doing, and saying, look, the risk of this is virtually zero, so you can feel comfortable with it. These other situations are truly dangerous. Please, please, please wear a mask indoors absolutely as often as possible, especially if you are not vaccinated.
David, Jonathan Lemire is here with a question for you. John?
Hey, David, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your piece. You started with a professor who says he talks to his class every year with a specific allegory, and in this case relates it to COVID-19. Can you walk us through exactly that example and what sort of broader lessons we all should be taking from it as we do debate this moment now about how to go about in a world where some people are vaccinated, some are not, some are wearing masks, some are not, as we're all trying to somehow get through this pandemic and as we see an end stage, hopefully just a few months away?
Yeah, I love that fable. So it's Judge Guido Calabrese, a federal judge and a longtime Yale Law School professor. And he has a class and he says to his students, look, I want you to imagine that a god comes forth and offers society a wondrous new invention. It makes your life better in almost every way. You can have jobs that you couldn't have had. You can spend more time with friends and family. But there's a cost. And the cost is that this god is going to strike down 1,000 young women and men in exchange for the invention every year. And he says to the class, would you take it? And almost invariably they say, no, we wouldn't take it. Well, that's not worth it. And then Judge Calabrese says, well, what's the difference between this and the automobile? Automobiles kill 40,000 Americans a year. They do make our lives more convenient in every way. And to me, the lesson here is when we're confronted with a new situation, a new risk, we are extremely cautious. But there are a set of enduring risks that we've just come to live with, like the automobile. And we're in this funny case with COVID right now, which is COVID has been horrible. It's been the worst infectious disease any of us has ever lived through. But for vaccinated people, the risk is actually tiny. It's tiny of getting it. It's even smaller of getting sick. It's tiny of infecting others. And so we're going to have to start to moderate our behavior and say, look, the risk is not zero if you're vaccinated, but it's so low that we should start to think of it more like a shark attack or a lightning strike. And we really do need to start doing some things again, because I'm really worried about the effects on kids. I'm worried about the effects on low-income people who can't work if we don't get back to normal. And that's why I thought of the fable this week.
Yeah, it's a great one. And 89 million people, you can see on our screen, are fully vaccinated in this country. 200 million vaccinations passed that milestone this week, but still a long way to go. Just over half of the country's adults have been vaccinated. David Leonhardt, Dr. Kavita Patel, great conversation. Thank you both for being here this morning. Coming up, the economy and jobs will be the focus of day 2 of the President's Climate Summit. We're back in 2 minutes with former EPA.
I'm genuinely optimistic because so much is beginning to happen. And because I believe in our ingenuity and our capacity. I know President Biden does. I've heard him talk about it. He believes we can do anything. You've heard him say it. And think about it. We are the country that went to the moon. And we didn't know how we were going to get there when President Kennedy announced that goal, but we did it. We are the country that invented the internet. Some people might regret that today, but we did that. We also got vaccines that are working, and we've shown we have the ability to get them out and put them in people's arms. So I believe that we have the ability.
That was U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry expressing his confidence that the country will make the emission reduction goals set yesterday by President Biden. Joining us now, White House National Climate Advisor Gina McCarthy, who helped establish the new emissions goals announced by President Biden yesterday. Great to have you back on the show. I'd like to ask you about that goal, and I'm looking at all the countries and the businesses that are involved in this summit. You've got all the big players at the table, but what's going to make something actually happen?
Well, the U.S. is back. That will make things happen, and we're bringing the world leaders together to tell them that. And really, the commitment we made was to send a very clear signal about the seriousness of what we're doing and have to get done on climate, and that the U.S. is interested in leading again. And it's very exciting because nothing has happened for about 4 years, even in the international community. And so we have to keep moving forward. But the fun thing is, and the tee-up was right, I am actually running off to do a jobs panel at a climate summit. And people might wonder why. And the reason is when Joe Biden hears climate, he thinks jobs and vice versa. Because what we put on the table was a strong commitment. But it's based on the understanding that clean energy in the United States is an area where we are growing jobs. It is not an area where we're going to be sacrificing. There's opportunities of the future here. And the president is interested in moving his American Jobs Plan forward so that we can make the kind of investments that's going to grow really good paying union jobs and bring real opportunity back to the United States to grab the future again, reignite our manufacturing, spend money on our transmission grid, because if we don't, we'll have more problems like we had in Houston, Texas. You know, it is time for us to invest in our own country and to grab that future for ourselves. That's what this is all about.
And absolutely on a nuts and bolts level, it is key to integrate jobs with the goal. You mentioned the U.S. is back. Can you talk about the challenges given the past 4 years about perhaps making sure that the United States' credibility to its commitment on these issues is put back in place?
Mika, we've been asked that question a bunch of times, but if you were at the summit, you would get a great sense that other countries are welcoming us back because they know that we have a worldwide challenge and they need the United States to stand up and be counted. That's what yesterday was about. That's what the conversation is. But the most important thing is that, you know, President Biden has created a people plan, not a climate plan. You know, he has made people understand that climate change is a problem. But the unbelievably interesting thing is that he's made it real for people again. He's told them, yes, we're going to move out away from this pandemic, and we're going to build hope and opportunity again. And so he's made it all about jobs, all about good housing, all about our roads and bridges, and yes, our transit system, our airport system. He's told people that in this country, we can invest in ourselves and it will work for all of us and build that middle class again. And we're going to make sure that it's paid for not by people who make $400,000 or less, but by corporations who haven't done their fair share. So it's going to right the ship in the United States, not just make sure that we're taking care of our planet. That's why people are excited about it. That's why we're going to move forward, and we're going to get this done.
Gina, it's Casey Hunt. I want to ask you about the mine workers and the work that you're doing more broadly to try to bring along people who are worried about being left behind, worried that the jobs they have or they've had in the past won't come along into this. And there has been some confusion. Initially, we had reported that the mine workers were enthusiastically backing the plan. Now they're saying, well, we like some of this, but we really actually want as many coal jobs to remain as possible. How do you reassure those people that there's a place for them?
Well, look, President Biden in this plan has left everything on the table, all kinds of solutions. So we know that there's real opportunity with carbon capture and sequestration to actually make sure that we're retaining that carbon and putting it in, sequestering it under the ground. But if you want to look at this, Casey, the president has been very clear since day one that a transition has been happening away from coal and other fossil fuels to clean energy. And that transition is economically bound. It's about what's less expensive. And so with eyes wide open, we went into this acknowledging that challenge, saying we're developing a plan, we're releasing that plan. And just last week, we had Senator Manchin and we had Cecil Roberts, who is the president of the United Mine Workers, standing up and saying, we are backing President Biden's plan. And so they know that there's a transition, but they need help and they need jobs. And